Written by Harlan Ellison, The City on the Edge of Forever appears in Season 1. It is Episode 28 and it premiered on April 5th, 1967. The episode was directed by Joseph Pevney and produced by Gene L. Kuhn. It would be the voice of Bartell LaRue that would play the Guardian of Forever, and a special guest star would feature Joan Collins, playing the role of Sister Edith Keeler. While investigating severe turbulence in space, the Enterprise is in orbit of what could possibly be the starting point of what Mr. Spock would refer to as ripples in time. The turbulence it was given the Enterprise a rough ride as a result, and Mr. Scott would inform the captain that the control circuits were threatening to overload. A short circuit did occur on Mr. Sulu's board and caused a small explosion, knocking him to the floor. Captain Kirk would summon Dr. McCoy to the bridge. Then he would instruct Lieutenant Uhura to send the past week's log entries of the turbulence that led them to the planet they were orbiting to Starfleet Command. He instructed her to report that either something or someone can affect changes in time, causing turbulent waves of space displacement. Once Dr. McCoy entered the bridge, he went right to Mr. Sulu and discovered that he was suffering from a heart flutter. He stated that he was going to risk giving Sulu a few drops of cortisone. Captain Kirk would say it's tricky stuff, and if he was sure about using it. He injected Mr. Sulu, who immediately was revived. And Dr. McCoy looked at the captain and said, "You were about to make a medical comment, Jim?" Mr. Spock would warn the captain that more waves of displacement were plotted, with the exception of one. When that wave hit, it shook the ship violently. Dr. McCoy would accidentally fall in a hypo which contained the cortisone, and the entire hypo would be injected into the doctor. Mr. Spock would observe that the hypo was now completely empty. We would see Dr. McCoy become very paranoid as a result. "Assassins! Murderers!" he would scream. Captain Kirk gave the order to the emergency medical team to report to the bridge. Dr. McCoy would become delirious and combative and flee the bridge. Captain Kirk would then order a security alert. On a supplemental log entry, Captain Kirk would state that 2 drops of cortisone could save a man's life. However, 100 times that amount had just been accidentally pumped into Dr. McCoy's body. In a strange, wild frenzy, he has fled the bridge. All connecting decks have been placed on alert. We have no way of knowing if the madness is permanent or temporary, or in what direction it will drive McCoy. Dr. McCoy would enter transporter room and attack the transporter chief, knocking him out. He would take his phaser and beam down to the planet. Once Captain Kirk was informed, Mr. Spock said that the transporter was set to the coordinates that showed the time displacement. Captain Kirk would instruct Mr. Spock to assemble a landing party. Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Lieutenant Uhura, Mr. Scott, accompanied by 2 crewmen, would beam down. Captain Kirk would instruct the party to begin recording. He would comment that the ruins are as far as the eye could see, and Mr. Spock would say that their age would be in the area of 10,000 centuries old. In the center stood an ancient ring-like structure. Captain Kirk would ask for an analysis. Mr. Spock, in amazement, would inform the captain that the structure was in fact the source of the time ripples. He could not offer an explanation, simply stating, "For this to do what it does is impossible to all science I understand." He went on to say that it was operating even now, putting out waves and waves of time displacement that we picked up millions of miles away. "Incredible power," Spock would say. "It cannot be a machine as we understand machines." "Then what is it?" Captain Kirk asked. At that moment, a voice came from the structure saying, "A question." It went on to say, "Since before your son was born in space and before you became a race, I have awaited a question." Captain Kirk asked, "What are you?" In reply, the structure said, "I am the Guardian of Forever." Kirk asked, "Are you a machine or being?" But the reply was, "I am both and neither. I am my own beginning and my own ending. Mr. Spock would tell Captain Kirk that it was a time portal, a gateway to other times and other dimensions if he was correct. As correct as possible for someone as limited intelligence as you, was the response. While this was going on, the rest of the landing party was searching for Dr. McCoy. They would find him, and he would suffer the effects of the Vulcan nerve pinch and be rendered unconscious. It was at this time that the Guardian of Forever was showing Captain Kirk and the landing party at different times in the center. It was like a screen that showed flashes of periods in time which could be visited. Kirk would get the idea to use the Guardian to go back in time one day prior, making sure the accident with the hypo was avoided. While discussing these possibilities, Dr. McCoy would regain consciousness and run through the center of the Guardian of Forever. When he went through, the image of the time period disappeared. "Where is he?" asked Captain Kirk. The Guardian of Forever would reply, "He has passed into what was." Lieutenant Uhura would then inform the captain that she lost communication with the Enterprise. Mr. Scott would say that there was nothing wrong with the communicators and he couldn't understand why they lost communication. But it would be the Guardian of Forever that would say, "Your vessel, your beginning, everything that you knew is gone." Captain Kirk would then state that Dr. McCoy has somehow changed history. Mr. Scott would say, "You mean we're stranded here?" Mr. Spock would add, "With no past, no future. Earth's not there, at least not the Earth we know," said Captain Kirk. "We're totally alone." Captain Kirk asked if it were possible to go back and prevent Dr. McCoy from changing the future. The Guardian would inform Kirk that all would be returned and everything would be as it was. Kirk would then instruct Mr. Scott that when he thought he had waited long enough, that he should try as well. That each member of the landing party must try, or at least go through, to be alive in some other world or time period. Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock would eventually follow Dr. McCoy through the center of the Guardian of Forever. Mr. Spock would estimate that the time period shortly before Dr. McCoy would go through and attempt to fix or prevent whatever he did to alter the future. It would be Mr. Spock to say when they would enter the portal. They would both jump through together and disappear. They would arrive in old Earth in a setting around 1930 Great Depression area. Passers-by would notice Mr. Spock and his ears. Kirk would suggest that they keep moving. "Look out, will ya? Why don't you look where you're going?" This was shouted at Mr. Spock as he attempted to cross the street and was nearly hit by a truck. Captain Kirk would later spot clothing for more appropriate attire for the time period. "Theft, Captain?" was his response. After bringing down the clothes, a police officer would approach them. Kirk would recognize the police officer by his accoutrements. In an attempt to explain Mr. Spock, he would say that he was obviously Chinese. While trying to explain his ears, he stated that when he was young, his head was caught in a mechanical rice picker. Luckily, there was an experienced plastic surgeon nearby. Of course, the police officer didn't believe him. He instructed Kirk and Spock to put the hands against the wall. A Vulcan neck pinch would allow them to flee the scene. They would run around the corner in front of a building that read 21st Street Mission on it. They would run around to find a door, and it was unlocked and they both went inside to hide. They would eventually be in the basement of the building, and they would change their clothes, and Mr. Spock would inform Captain Kirk that they were approximately a week there before Dr. McCoy would go through. He continued to say that perhaps curries, currents, and eddies could exist in a passage of time that would allow them to be brought to the same spot that Dr. McCoy had gone through. They would later be discovered as the lights would turn on and a female voice would say, "Who's there?" Captain Kirk would state that they didn't mean to trespass and that it was cold outside. The woman would reply that a lie is not a very good way to say hello, and it really isn't that cold out. Kirk would tell her that the police were chasing them. and they had stole the clothes that they were wearing. He went on to say that they didn't have any money. The woman would say that she could use help with general cleaning duties. She would later say that they would get 15 cents an hour for 15-hour days. After introductions of Kirk and Spock, she would state that her name was Edith Keeler, and she ran the 21st Street mission. Kirk and Spock's first assignment was cleaning the basement. Later that evening at dinner, Kirk and Spock would be served their first meal of the period. Edith Keeler would address those eating in the room by stating that she was not a do-gooder. If you're a bum or can't break off the booze or whatever that it is that makes you a bad risk, then get out. Now, I don't pretend to tell you how to find happiness and love when every day is just a struggle to stay alive. But I do insist that you do survive, because the days and years ahead are worth living for. One day soon, man is going to be able to harness incredible energies, maybe even the atom. Energies that could ultimately hurl us to other worlds in some sort of spaceship. And the men that reach out into space will be able to find ways to feed the hungry millions of the world and cure the diseases. They will be able to find a way to give each man hope in a common future. And those are the days worth living for. Kirk would comment that atomic power is years away and spaceflight years after that. He would later say that he found her most uncommon. After dinner, Edith would tell Captain Kirk how impressed she was with their work and that they could report at 7 o'clock the next morning. She asked if they had a flop for the night. Kirk had no idea what she was saying. She said a flop is a place to sleep, and she said there was a vacant room where she lived for $2 a week. We later see Mr. Spock in their room working on a makeshift computer in which to connect his tricorder to. He asks Captain Kirk for some platinum, a small amount, 5 or 6 pounds worth, to use as a duodignetic field core. Kirk would then respond by saying, "Mr. Spock, I have brought you some assorted vegetables, bologna and hard roll for myself, and the other 9/10 of our combined salaries for the last 3 days in fulfilling this order for you. Mr. Spock, this bag does not contain platinum, silver, or gold, nor is it likely to in the near future." Mr. Spock would respond by saying, "Captain, you're asking me to work with equipment which is hardly very far ahead of stone knives and bear skins." Later, while working, Mr. Spock would notice 2 men working on a clock with tools for finely detailed work. He would open the combination lock off the locker and take the tools. The next morning, Edith Keeler would be very upset and confront them. Mr. Spock said he needed the tools for his radio work. He also said that they would have been returned in the morning. Kirk would assure her that if Mr. Spock said he would have returned the tools, then she could bet that he would have returned them. She could bet her reputation on it. She said she would forgive the incident if Kirk walked her home. And still, she had a lot of questions because they both seemed very out of place. While Captain Kirk was walking Edith Keeler home, Mr. Spock had a breakthrough. He momentarily had seen that Edith Keeler had died. A newspaper clipping read "Social worker killed." When Kirk returned, Spock had told him that he was able to see certain things that may be distressing to him. They watched the tricorder view screen, and it showed a newspaper clipping from February 23rd of 1936, 6 years from the date they were currently in. It featured Miss Keeler, and Kirk read part of it, reading it aloud. "The President and Edith Keeler conferred for some time today, but that's all he could say, as he could read no further as the board would overload and short out. Kirk would be impressed she would speak with the President and have such an impressive future. However, Spock would inform him that the other possible time period where Edith Keeler would be killed in some sort of traffic accident. Mr. Spock would inform him that Edith Keeler was the focal point in time that they were searching for. Her 2 possible futures would dictate the outcome of history and that Dr. McCoy was the random element. We would later see the point in time in which Dr. McCoy would enter the time period. He'd still be screaming hysterically, and he approached a man demanding to know what planet he was on. The man would run, and McCoy would eventually catch up with him. He thought the constellations looked like those of Earth, but he wasn't sure. He would ultimately succumb to the cordrazine and pass out. The man would then steal Dr. McCoy's phaser, and not knowing what he was doing, he would put it to overload and phase himself out. The following morning, Dr. McCoy would make his way to the 21st Street Mission and ask for coffee. Edith Keeler would take him to the back, concerned about his appearance, and let him sleep on a cot until he recovered. Meanwhile, back in their room, Mr. Spock would repair the circuits and try to use them again. This time the screen showed what history should have been. This meant that Miss Keeler would die the same year. They were able to see how Dr. McCoy had changed history. They discovered that Edith Keeler would be responsible for a pacifist movement which would delay the United States entering World War II. And as a result, Germany would be the country to develop the atomic bomb and ultimately win the war. They concluded that Dr. McCoy prevented Edith Keeler from dying, thus changing history. That is when Captain Kirk told Mr. Spock that he was in fact in love with Edith Keeler, and Mr. Spock reminded him that she must die to restore their timeline. With the effects of the cordrazine slowly wearing off, Dr. McCoy was starting to question his surroundings. He thought that he either must be unconscious or suffering from dementia. When the effects were completely gone, he thought he was hallucinating. Miss Keeler told him that she was going to see a Clark Gable movie, and Dr. McCoy didn't know who he was. Later, as we see Kirk and Edith Keeler walking, she speaks of a Clark Gable movie, and Kirk does not know who he is. Astounded, she says that exactly is what Dr. McCoy had said, the same reaction. Excited, Kirk turns to her and says, "McCoy? Leonard McCoy?" He would then go tell Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy would walk out the front door, reuniting the three of them. Edith Keeler was across the street when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy were reunited. She slowly began to walk towards them, not noticing the traffic. Dr. McCoy noticed a truck headed her way and shouted at her to move her, or to help her. Captain Kirk then hugged Dr. McCoy to prevent him from going to assist, and as a result, the truck would strike her, killing her at the scene. Dr. McCoy looked at Captain Kirk and said, "I could have saved her. Do you know what you just did?" Mr. Spock looked at him and said, "He knows, Doctor. He knows." At that instant, they were transported back to their own time period. Kirk and Spock first, then Dr. McCoy followed them. Mr. Scott would say that they just left a moment ago, and Mr. Spock would say that they were successful. The Guardian said that the time has resumed its shape, all is as it was before. Many such journeys are possible. Let me be your gateway. Lieutenant Uhura then said the Enterprise was calling and wanted to know if they wanted to beam up. With a pained look on his face, Captain Kirk said, "Let's get the hell out of here." They would all beam up, leaving the Guardian forever to wait patiently for its next visitor.